Hi everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Professor Bob Long. Today's video is going to be us going over the vascular system of the human body, and really what we're going to be doing is a lab video, an anatomy video of the wireman model. Now, we call this the wireman for obvious reasons. It's a bunch of wires, both red and blue, arteries in red, veins in blue, and it's in the shape of a little man representing sort of a It is not drawn to scale, or it's not built to scale, but it's pretty close. But it gives you a very good, reasonable idea of where the arteries and veins are in the human body. Now, learning the wireman in a face-to-face setting is confusing at first for a lot of students because it's a big bowl of red and blue spaghetti here. And especially looking at a video or a flat picture of it, it's really hard to see the three-dimensionality. This is why I'm not a big fan of online learning, especially for anatomy and physiology. Some topics maybe, but nonetheless, in the current situation, this is what we have to deal with. So what I'm going to be doing is teaching you how to learn the wireman and what I think is the best way possible to learn it, which is by drawing it out and getting a map in your brain. And then we're going to come back to the model, and we're going to apply that map by looking at the model and naming all the vessels, okay? So I'm going to teach you a few things in this first video. This is going to be a series of videos over the wireman. If we tried to do it all at once, the video would be 4 hours long. It takes us several labs to learn all of the wireman in a face-to-face setting. So we're going to learn this over a series of videos so that you guys don't get too bored. Once we get past 30 minutes, it's kind of hard to keep watching. So anyway, I'm going to move wireman out of the way because we're going to come back to him later, and I don't want him to distract us or taking up our part of what we're seeing here. Now, before we even get to wireman, I have to explain the arteries are red, veins are blue thing. I want you guys to learn this little love poem that you can recite all the time to your loved ones or to your classmates when you're in nursing school or whatever. Arteries are red, veins are blue, except for the pulmonaries. Now, I know it doesn't rhyme and it's not very romantic, but it works. Arteries are red, veins are blue, except for the pulmonaries. The pulmonary arteries and veins are reversed. The pulmonary artery is blue, the pulmonary vein is red. So I'm going to roll wireman back in here for a second, and I want you to see this. If it's red on the wireman, it's an artery. If it's blue on the wireman, it's a vein. Unless we're talking about the pulmonary arteries and veins on any of our models. Arteries are red, veins are blue, except for the pulmonaries. They're backwards. If you can remember that, then when you're naming things, if it's red, it must be an artery. If it's blue, it must be a vein. If we were going to the lungs, if it's red, it's a vein, because the pulmonaries are backwards. And if it's blue, it's a pulmonary artery, okay? And I'm going to show you why right here in this drawing, and then we're going to move on to learning the arteries that go to the head. And the reason I want to do this in a series of drawings is because it's easier to learn a smaller chunk of information through repetition than a whole bunch. So we're going to trace a drop of blood from the heart to the brain, and we're just going to learn the arteries. Then we'll do another video where we trace a drop of blood from the heart to the hand and only learn those. And then you can practice doing all of them back to back to back. We'll do another video, a third video of going from the heart to the abdomen and then from the heart to the feet. Then we'll do the veins afterwards. So we're going to do arteries and then we're going to do veins in a series of short videos, okay? The first one's going to be a little bit long, but I have to explain a few things. So I'm going to erase our little love poem here. I hope you have it memorized and hope you learn it. I actually have two former students who went through the nursing program together that got married, and he gave her that poem one time and they laughed and they emailed me because they were dating and they got married, and he gave her an anniversary card that said arteries are red, veins are blue except for the pulmonaries and I love you or something like that. And they laughed and remembered they were in my class together. That's where they first met. Anyway, now if we were to look at the human heart has 4 chambers to it, okay? And there's some vessels coming into the human heart on either side. One from above, one from below, into the right side of the heart. Remember, we're going to be talking about the subject's right and left, not yours. So if you were looking at my heart, this would be my right side, this would be my left side. So this small chamber is going to have 3 little flaps that drain blood into a much larger chamber down here. And then that chamber is going to have a pipe that comes out that's going to go up to the lungs. Okay? As blood goes from the right side of our heart to our lungs to give off carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen, then the blood is going to return back to the left side of the heart. And so there's another chamber over here on the left. And it really has 4 vessels that come into it, but I'm only going to draw 2 because this is just for illustration. And it only has 2 flaps leading to this larger chamber underneath. And then this chamber is actually going to have a pipe that comes out like this, a very large vessel. That comes out and it's going to go to tissues or organs. Now I'm going to write something right here just as a reminder. All cells in the human body and our tissues, our cells, need oxygen in the presence of glucose and in the presence of mitochondria to make 36 molecules of ATP, or up to 36 molecules of ATP, plus some carbon dioxide, plus some water. Now, we're not going to balance the equation right now. We've done that already, or we'll do that when we do the blood chapter, okay? But this basic equation is energy production in our cells. Without the oxygen, we can convert glucose into ATP. Mitochondria aren't involved in that. But we only get 2 ATP. And the beauty of mitochondria, when we learn this later in the semester, the beauty of the mitochondria is that they take the leftovers from that process of producing only 2 net ATP. They take the leftovers and convert it into 34 more ATP, 32 to 34. We get up to 36 ATP from 1 molecule of glucose. That's a massive output of energy. It requires the input of oxygen, and it releases carbon dioxide from the tissue when we do that. And that's an important part of all of this. You also have to remember one other thing. In our red blood cells, there are billions of these molecules called hemoglobin. It's made out of a basic ring called heme. And then when we stick an iron ion in here, Fe2 plus would be ferric, heme becomes hemoglobin. And if you've watched the lecture videos on blood, you've learned this. Hemoglobin has 4 rings, 2 alpha chains, 2 beta chains, blah, blah, blah. As long as iron is bound to hemoglobin, which is why iron is important in our diet, one of the reasons, that allows 1 hemoglobin molecule to carry 4 oxygen molecules. And of course, the protein, when it binds these oxygens, will change its shape a little bit. And that allows it to absorb photons of light. Hemoglobin not only can bind oxygen and or carbon dioxide, it's also a pigment. And what that means is it will absorb all the photons of light from the different wavelengths that we learned in the sensory system when we did vision. But as long as oxygen is bound, it does not absorb a certain part of the red spectrum, and it will reflect red light. And so when blood is fully oxygenated, oxygenated blood glows a bright reddish color. When I remove oxygen from the hemoglobin and it pops off, it goes through this whole reaction here. When it gets to a tissue and the tissue pops out carbon dioxide, then carbon dioxide will be picked up by the hemoglobin and it will pick up sort of this bluish green color. I'm using a light blue color. I really should use a darker blue color, but it will pick up carbon dioxide. Now, actually it doesn't carry 4 CO2s based on the size of the molecules and all of this other stuff. There's a whole bunch of physics and physiology that I'm not going to go into when you do biochemistry and you do biophysics. But when it picks up carbon dioxide, hemoglobin will then change its shape and absorb all the photons except for those in the bluish greenish spectrum. And the blue-green color is called cyanin. And when we are cyanic or cyanotic, depending on how you read it in the books, but cyanin is a blue-green color. And so when hemoglobin has carbon dioxide attached to it, our blood looks sort of a bluish-greenish color, sort of the blue-green that you see in your veins. And so when blood is oxygenated, it's red. When blood is deoxygenated, carrying carbon dioxide, more carbon dioxide than oxygen, deoxygenated blood is the cyanic color, the cyanin, which is the bluish color, where we get actually the name for the toxin, the poison, called cyanide. Cyanide actually causes your blood to not be able to bind any oxygen, and it binds carbon dioxide, and you die from lack of energy production in your cells. It's a horrible death, supposedly. But anyway, so cyanin, or the cyanic color, is when we have deoxygenated blood. Now, knowing that, I'm going to erase some of this. When my blood is returning to the heart from all my tissues and organs, at the tissues, they gave off all the oxygen and the blood is deoxygenated. And that deoxygenated blood is going to have a blue color. And as it returns through the inferior and the superior vena cava, goes through the right atrium, the tricuspid valve, the right ventricle, it'll go through the aortic valve, the pulmonary valve. It goes up this vessel called the pulmonary trunk and out to the lungs. When it gets to the lungs, all the carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere. And then plants suck it all up, and we don't have to worry about it a whole bunch, although it is rising, who knows. I'm not going to get into the politics of all that. But nonetheless, from the atmosphere, as the red blood cell empties with carbon dioxide, due to the high concentration of oxygen out here, oxygen wants to flow from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration, and the blood is deoxygenated. So oxygen will enter our blood from the atmosphere, and then that blood is going to return through some vessels. This oxygenated blood will be bright red. It's going to return from our lungs through these two vessels into the left atrium, the bicuspid valve, the left ventricle. It'll go out the aortic valve, and then out this vessel. This vessel is called the aorta, and that oxygenated blood will go to our tissues and organs. They'll use up all that oxygen and send back the deoxygenated blood. We have to send it from the right side of the heart to the lungs, the pulmonary pump. We exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. As oxygen comes into the blood, it comes back through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. So these vessels here are your pulmonary arteries in blue here. These vessels are the pulmonary veins. Okay, this is really confusing to a lot of students, but look. The true definition of an artery is any vessel that carries blood away from the heart. The true definition of a vein is any vessel that carries blood or returns blood back to the heart. These are veins bringing blood in. These are arteries carrying blood out. And when I go from the aorta to all the other arteries going to tissues and organs, the blood is going to be oxygenated. When it gets to the tissues, it gives off all the oxygen, it picks up carbon dioxide, and then returns through all the veins and the vena cava back to the heart. And you're going to see that as we learn the wireman, what I'm talking about. And then that blood goes through the lungs, gives off the carbon dioxide, picks up oxygen. So arteries are red, veins are blue, except for the pulmonaries. The pulmonary arteries are carrying deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs. The pulmonary veins are going to return blood to the heart from the lungs. And because this blood is deoxygenated, the pulmonary arteries are blue. Because this blood is oxygenated, the pulmonary veins are red. Arteries are red, veins are blue, except for the pulmonaries. They're reversed. Arteries are red, veins are blue, except for the pulmonaries. I hope that you can visually see why this is happening, okay? Now, I'm going to erase all this because we're going to actually start tracing blood from the left ventricle up to the head. And we're always going to have to go out this large vessel called the aorta. Now, I'm going to erase all of this, and we're actually going to draw the vessels that go to the head. Now, again, I like to draw this like a little stick map, because if you could draw it and label it, then you have mastered the anatomy of the arteries and veins. So I'm going to draw the arteries to the head, and then I'm going to do a video of me showing you those arteries to the head on the wireman. And then we'll do the arteries to the arm, and then the arteries on wireman, and so on and so forth till we complete all of this. Now, when we do this, I'm going to draw the heart a little bit low because I need room to work up to the head here. I'm going to draw it over here because I'm going to create a list of vessels with a little key to my drawing here. Okay? Now, if I draw the heart, the largest vessel coming out of the heart, it's going to come out of the left side of the heart. It's going to be the largest artery in the body. And this artery always looks the same. It's the first vessel coming out of the left ventricle. And I'm going to label this vessel number 1 on our drawing. Okay? So the first vessel we're going to label on our drawing is going to be the aorta. The aorta is a very large vessel, and it really doesn't go off to the left. It really runs straight back a little bit and then to the left, back and to the left, like the movie JFK, back and to the left. Anyway, so I've got a flat board here, so I can't draw going backwards, but this vessel looks like it's coming to the left. It will really go back and to the left right behind the heart. Now the aorta has several branches to it, or several parts to the aorta. There's a muscle that comes across here called the diaphragm. Now the diaphragm is sort of a border that's going to show us where the aorta changes names from the thoracic aorta in the thoracic cavity to the abdominal aorta in the abdomen. It runs all the way down our abdomen close to the spine. And the thoracic aorta changes names depending on exactly where along the aorta we are. Saying something has happened on the aorta, like there's an aneurysm on the aorta, a weak spot where the wall is bulging out and can rupture. If an aortic aneurysm happens, usually a person dies because you bleed out. But saying there's an aneurysm on the aorta is like saying the person who stole your car is somewhere in the state of Texas. Doesn't really give you a good idea. But if we could say they're in Houston, Texas, or Dallas, Texas, or this part of Texas, the Panhandle, you have an idea. So the aorta is divided into 4 subregions. And some of those subregions are based on the fact that there's major branches coming off the aorta. And as we come off the aorta, the first 2 branches to come off go into the heart itself or cover the heart. We learned those as the coronary arteries when we studied the heart, the right and left coronary artery. They're not going to be on our list because they're not on our wireman. But as we come up the aorta here, there's going to be a larger, sort of a thick branch that comes off and goes a little bit to the right. You have to remember it's the subject's right and left, not yours. Okay? Now, this first branch coming off is going to split into 2, and I'm going to leave them rather short for a reason I'm going to explain in a moment. Now, if I go back to the aorta, there's another branch that's going to go up to the head, and then off of the aorta, there's always going to be a 3rd branch that comes off this way, going out to your left arm. So every time we look at the heart, any of the heart models, anytime you see the heart, there's a large vessel coming up and arching back, and it has 3 main branches coming off outside the heart. Now, those branches help us define the different sections of the aorta. So I'm going to draw sort of a dotted line here across. And I'm going to label these sections 1A, 1B, 1C, and 1D. So under number 1, the aorta, the A part is called the ascending aorta. And we don't have to say aorta artery because it's in the name, okay? But the ascending aorta, blood will come out of the left ventricle and go up the aorta there. Once we get to about where this vessel is, it starts to arch back and to the left, or it arches over, and that section is often referred to as the aortic arch. And as it comes back and to the left, it will eventually start to come down the chest here. And so this entire section where it's going down is called the descending aorta for obvious reasons, because blood is going to be descending. And some people call that the descending thoracic aorta. But a lot of times in medicine, if we say descending aorta, the thoracic is implied, because once we cross the diaphragm, this exact same vessel changes names a fourth time. This is all the same vessel. I'm sure in your town, just like where I live, you have a street that goes down so far, and once you cross a certain landmark or another street, the name changes. Here in Corpus, the city that I live in, Corpus Christi, we have a street called Weber, and as you go down Weber Road towards our bayfront, as soon as you cross another road called Alameda, where there's one of our famous landmarks, Boatnet, once you cross that, the same street that you're on turns into Doddridge. They just did that. I don't know why. But there's a landmark where it changes names. So the landmark where the ascending aorta changes names is this vessel. As it comes down, it changes names to the descending aorta. So ascending aorta, aortic arch, descending aorta. And then this part D, is called the abdominal aorta, because it's going to run through the abdominal cavity. And some people will say descending thoracic and descending abdominal. But usually when someone says descending, they're talking about the thoracic, because in the abdominal aorta, it's obviously descending or going down all the way, hugging your spine to close to the waist area. So we have 4 parts: ascending aorta, aortic arch, descending thoracic aorta, and descending abdominal aorta. Now, on the aortic arch, we have 3 major vessels that come off. If we were coming up the aorta, if you were drawing a road map from your house to some location, but you always had to take the same main street, then there's going to be a number of left turns that we could take as we go this way. The first branch that you could take off of the aortic arch, I'm going to label that number 2. That branch is very, very short, and then it's going to go up to our head and out to our arm. And that tells us the name of this vessel. So number 2 is called the Brachiocephalic Artery. I'm always going to abbreviate artery with the letter A. I'm not going to write it out every time. But the name tells you brachio goes to brachium, your arm. Cephalic, cephalon is the head. So this branch, or this little vessel, is going to branch into one that goes to the arm and one that goes to the head. So we call it the Brachiocephalic Artery. And then this vessel that goes straight up, although it looks very short, and I'm going to explain that in a minute, is called the right common carotid artery. Okay. Now, if I don't put right or left on the name of the vessel, that means there's only one. There's only one aorta. There's not a right aorta and a left aorta. There's only one brachiocephalic artery. There's not a right one and a left one. There's only one. But there are 2 common carotids, one on the right and one on the left. So anytime you see me put right or left, that means there's 2, and there's one on the opposite side of whatever side that I've labeled. So this is your brachiocephalic artery, right common carotid, and it's pronounced carotid, not carotid. There's no extra O in it. Carotid, like rotted meat or something that's rotting. Carotid, right common carotid artery. Now, the other branch that comes off the brachiocephalic is going to go this way, and it's going to go underneath your right clavicle. That one is going to be called the right subclavian artery for below the clavicle. Now, I want to bring the wireman in for a second, and I just want to show you something that I have to illustrate so that this isn't too confusing, okay? If you look carefully at the wireman, what you're going to see is they have cut all the arteries off of the right side of the model and removed them. So we do have a little branch going up to the head and one going out to the arm here, and that would be your right common carotid and right subclavian, but they're cut short. And they removed all the arteries on the right side of the model so that we could focus on the veins. They've cut all the veins off of the left side of the model so we could focus on the arteries. And for that reason, I'm not going to trace these two out. But what I want you to realize is, as we do those vessels on the left side, anything I label left over here would also happen on the right side. They're just cut on our wireman. So we're going to label the arteries on the left side of the body for the most part. So now, ascending aorta, and then I have the brachiocephalic artery, the right common carotid goes up to the skull, the right subclavian goes out underneath your clavicle to your arm. They've been cut. So now we're going to go back to the aorta, just like if you came down two dead-end roads. You come back, and then the next branch we could go down would be this one. That one is going to be called the left common carotid artery. Now, the reason we have the brachiocephalic is this. The heart is situated a little bit to the left, it's a little bit twisted, and the aorta comes off and back and to the left. So as I'm coming off the aorta, if I needed to go up the left side of my neck, where the left common carotid goes, and go into my skull and on the scalp here, if I needed to do that on the right side, then I'd have to come over a little bit and then go up the right side of the neck as the common carotid. So I'd have a right common carotid. And then I'd have a fourth branch coming over, going right underneath the right subclavian. Well, why have two branches going in the same direction? Why not fuse them into one larger vessel, the brachiocephalic? The brachiocephalic comes over a little bit, and then it splits into the right common carotid and the right subclavian arteries. Okay, that's why we only have one brachiocephalic. I don't need it on this side. I can go straight up to the skull or straight out to the arm. So, brachiocephalic, right common carotid, right subclavian. Left common carotid comes directly off the aorta. Now, if I follow the left common carotid up, it's going to split in two. And these vessels are going to go up. One's going to go into the skull medially, and one's going to go outside the skull to feed my face and my scalp. And if I were to draw this side, if I were to continue it on, it would do the same thing, but they've cut the model so we don't see this. Now, the one that always goes in towards the middle or medially is going to be the internal. The one that goes out is going to be the external. It goes lateral. So this would be my left internal carotid and my left external carotid arteries. And those two carotids, the internal and the external, share this one in common, hence the name common carotid. The right common carotid would also have a right internal and right external carotid artery. We're just not going to label them because they're not visible on the wireman. So this is going to be the left internal carotid artery and the left external carotid artery. Now, if we were to follow them, I'm going to draw this a little bit more uniform with this. If we were to follow them, the internal carotids are going to meet up inside the skull. And where they do meet, they're going to form this little vessel that has some other branches coming off. Okay. Now, we're not going to follow all the extra branches of the external carotid. We're just not. There's a lot of vessels that we're not going to name. You would do that at the next level of anatomy and physiology if you had to go on to a higher level. Then you would add the next layer of detail. Otherwise, we could spend an entire semester learning the vasculature of the head. We're not going to do that. So now, If I go all the way back to the aorta, this branch coming off here is going to be called the left subclavian artery. So you can clearly see that anything I have on the right, I also have on the left over here. Right subclavian, left subclavian. Right common carotid, left common carotid. The only difference is, because the heart is a little over, we have the brachiocephalic that reaches over and then splits into the right common carotid and right subclavian. Now, my model is not drawn to scale. My drawing is not to scale. And there's another vessel that comes off very closely here, but I'm going to draw it a little bit further out. And they're going to come up, and they're also going to meet right down here, close to this vessel. So this extra vessel, I'm going to change the color so that we can trace it. We'll also come up and do this. And I'm going to show you why I'm doing this way. Okay, and I know it looks kind of crazy, but this is not how it really looks in reality, but it'll give you an idea. Those two vessels are called the right and left vertebral arteries. And the reason they're called that, if you recall when we studied the vertebrae, cervical vertebrae had 3 holes. They have this little notch on the back. They have their vertebral foramen. They have their body, and then they have their transverse process. And only cervical vertebrae have the transverse foramen. Well, these little vessels, the vertebral arteries, and the vertebral veins also, would run through the transverse foramen of the cervical vertebrae. So they got called the vertebral arteries. Okay? That's why they're named what they are. Now, the vertebrals and the internal carotids are going to meet up at this little vessel that sits right here at the base of the skull. And I'm running out of some room here. I don't have enough space up here. I'm going to try to add it to the bottom of the board and hope I can fit these last 2 in. But that one is called the Basilar Artery. And it's called the Basilar Artery because it sits at the base of your brain. It runs along the medulla and the pons once it enters the skull. And the basilar artery has a bunch of small arteries that go off to the right and the left, which we're not going to name, but it looks like a little single pulled ladder, okay? And then at the very end of the basilar artery, it makes a little loop that goes around where we had the sella turcica of the skull. It makes a little loop there, and your pituitary hangs right inside that. And so this vessel here, number 11, I'm going to write it over here, is called the Cerebral Arterial Circle. I simply ran out of room down here, and I didn't want to try to squeeze all this in. But it's called the Cerebral Arterial Circle, and many textbooks still call it the Circle of Willis, after a physician who first described it in literature. So the basilar artery will make the Circle of Willis, or the Cerebral Arterial Circle. Now that's quite a lot of stuff. It's 11 vessels. Learn these vessels before you study anything else. When you get your chance to do wireman, or you should learn to draw this road map, and just draw these first branches and label them. Aorta, ascending aortic arch, descending thoracic, abdominal aorta. Brachiocephalic, left common carotid, left subclavian. Brachiocephalic, left common carotid, left subclavian. Then, if I follow the brachiocephalic, I get the right common carotid, the right subclavian, and the right vertebral. Over here, the left common carotid branches into the internal carotid and the external carotid. The internal carotid goes through the carotid canal and feeds my brain, and the external carotid will fan out and feed a lot of my face and scalp. And then the left subclavian comes directly off the aorta also, and then it'll go out to my arm underneath the clavicle. It has a branch called the left vertebral, which will also come up here and meet near the basilar artery, and then that forms the Circle of Willis, or the Cerebral Arterial Circle. Okay? It's quite a handful, it's quite a lot in this first video, but that's the best way to learn it, in my opinion, is to take out some red markers or red map pencils or a marker board with a red marker and just try to learn to draw it and map it in your brain. Okay? Now, I'm going to erase all this, and in a minute, I'm going to do another video where I'm going to show you all of these vessels on the wireman. But we're hitting about the 30-minute mark, and I don't want to go on too long. So, Thanks for watching the drawing of the vessels to the head. Now we're going to do the vessels to the head on the wire man. Thanks for watching. Hope you had as much fun as I did. See you in the next video.